and welcome to my little presentation on the top 11 things that international students should know about Canadian law. My name is Paul Morrison, and I'm a lawyer here in Elmer, Ontario. My wife and I have been volunteering with the International Student Ministries group here in London, Ontario, for several years now. And this is a version of a talk I've given several times in that time frame, and that the students always seem to think is very helpful. Keep in mind a couple of things throughout this presentation. One is my background is as a lawyer in Ontario, and the laws of Ontario and the laws of other provinces may disagree slightly on some things. And so some of the specific things like landlord tenant law and consumer protection law might vary somewhat from province to province. So if you're watching this in Alberta or BC, obviously it's going to be a different set of rules. The other caveat is that this is a sort of general knowledge presentation. It's not going to take the place of getting proper legal advice if you have a real problem. My advice to anybody who has an issue that is legal in nature is that they should consult a lawyer right away and get good advice, because getting good advice is the way to getting the best results. Okay. In terms of how this presentation was put together, we conducted a poll on our Facebook group of a series of topics and asked students which ones were the most important to them. And so they ranked these for us. There is one that I tacked on at the end that wasn't in the original presentation when we first did the poll. If you do have questions about any of the material, you can look at the comments below. You can post a comment below, and hopefully I'll see it and be able to respond to it. And also, if you're looking for resources, I'm going to try and put some of the resources down there as well, so that you have a listing of resources that you can look to. So, without further belaboring the point anymore, here are the top 11 things international students should know about Canadian law. So, the first thing is, are my parents allowed to get information from the school, from the landlord, from anybody like that? And it may seem odd for you if you come from a culture where your parents are very highly honored and are very involved in their children's lives, but and there's nothing wrong with that. That's actually a great thing. I personally believe it as well. The Bible says to honor your father and your mother, so that it may go well with you. And I really believe that is a really wonderful thing, and it's something that my wife and I try and do with our parents, and we hope our children will grow up to do as well. But the law of Canada is different. The law of Canada treats anyone who's over the age of 18 as an adult. And that means that, if you're only 18 years old, the school can't give any information to your parents. Once you're 18, they have to deal with you. And if you're the only person on your lease, your landlord can't talk to your parents either. Now, if they're guaranteeing the lease, they can, or if they're co-signer on the lease, they can. But in most cases, if the landlord needs to talk to somebody, they're going to be talking to you directly. And that's because in Canada, we have privacy laws that are designed to keep your affairs separate from those of other people. And so parents don't have an automatic right to be involved in their child's business. And your parents have no right to demand information from other people. The second thing that international students should know about Canadian law is that there have been a series of scams that have targeted international students, and particularly students from China. And in these scams, what happens is the student receives a threatening phone call. and they're instructed not to answer their phone, use social media, or contact their parents in any way. Or usually there's some threat that somebody back in the old country will be harmed, or there will be some threat that they'll do some harm to you here. And then the scammer contacts your parents back in your home country, and they claim that they've kidnapped you. And then when your parents try to call you, they can't get a hold of you because you've been instructed not to answer the phone. And as a result, they think it's true that you really have been kidnapped. And then they try and extract a ransom from your parents. A ransom is like money from your parents in exchange for your safe release. But the reality is you've never actually been kidnapped, right? And so what should you do if you get a call like this? Well, the first thing you should do is call the police. I know in some jurisdictions, some places around the world, police are not really all that trustworthy. But here in Canada, they typically are. And the threat is not usually a real threat, either here or back in the other country. The scammers are relying upon the fact that the people involved might be afraid of going to the police. And so they're preying upon that. So the easiest way to break that is to just go and talk to the police, right? The third thing that Canadian students should know, international students should know about Canadian law, is what to do if you have a problem with your landlord. And this is incredibly common. I would say that when I go to Focus Club, or we have focus dinners, or we used to have focus dinners before COVID in London, I would get requests every week or two, like for landlord and tenant issues. When you're living in close proximity with other people, it doesn't always work out. And the reality is some people who are renting properties will take advantage of the fact that people don't know the law. And so in Ontario, we have a law called the Residential Tenancies Act. This law limits what landlords and tenants can do. It has, in particular, there are some strict rules about raising the rent. So you can't raise the rent, just like the landlord just can't come to you after you've been living there for 6 months and say, I'm raising the rent, I'm doubling your rent. They can't do that. Even if you don't have a lease, they can't do that. Because there's a section of the Residential Tenancies Act that says that if they're going to give an increase in rent, they can only do it once a year, and it can only be a certain amount that is pegged to the inflation rate. And so it doesn't go up that much that fast. And there are some excellent resources around in our area for dealing with these kinds of problems. And I suspect that in most other universities, there's probably similar resources. Fanshawe College has a housing mediator that you can call. He works for Fanshawe, and he will call up the landlord and he'll explain the law to the landlord and hopefully be able to mediate the problem so that the problem is resolved. And if that doesn't work, there is also another option, and that is Western University at their law school has a community legal services department. And the community legal services department serves primarily students. And a lot of what they do is residential tenancies work. So, your landlord and tenant law. And what you're getting from the university community legal services is a law student, usually a second or third year law student, who is acting on the instructions of an actual lawyer who's employed by the law school, and who is telling the student how to act in your case, right? To give them to help them learn how to advocate for people in a situation like yours. And so you usually get very good representation, and it's all entirely free if you qualify. So that's a great resource as well. And I suspect that most other schools have similar personnel around this because it is a very common problem. And the Landlord and Tenant Board actually has a fantastic website too that answers a lot of the basic questions. So, it is a great resource as well. If you do take your landlord dispute to the tribunal, it has to go to something called the Landlord and Tenant Board, which is it's like a court, but it's not a court. It's like below a court, but it's highly specialized. And because of that, the people who work there tend to actually know the law really well because they're only responsible for knowing that one law. And they also have, for tenants, they have free legal aid there. And so you can get the assistance of a legal aid lawyer who can give you some advice there as well for free. And they are a trained lawyer as well. And then they also have mediation services as part of their process that can help divert many of these disputes. In a lot of cases, it's somebody doesn't know the law. And the problems can be easily resolved once it's made clear to somebody what the law actually says. So, this is a big issue for students in particular because, housing is one of the most expensive parts of their budget, and it's one that comes up regularly. Look for those free legal services in your area, and especially through the university and colleges, they tend to be very good at what they do. So those are a great resource. And the key is to get good advice. The next thing that international students should know is the rules around working while you're here in Canada. And the general rule is it all depends on what your permit says. So your study permit will indicate if you're allowed to work off campus or not. If it does, you're allowed to work for up to 20 hours a week, as long as school is in session, or full-time when it is during a break. So a lot of students were working when schools were shut down because of COVID, and even now many of them are working part-time, 20 hours or less. And if your permit doesn't allow you to work off campus, then basically you're restricted to working on campus. And many universities and colleges have programs designed for students whose work permits don't allow them to work outside of the school, to work, at facilities there, either, in stores or food service, that kind of thing. The next question I get a lot from students is, what can I do if an employer is mistreating me? And this is quite common. Unfortunately, it seems like many employers oftentimes hire people from their own ethnic groups. And you would think that, if a Hindu man was hiring a Hindu student to work for him, he'd treat them fairly. Or if a Muslim man was hiring an Iranian student, he would treat them fairly. But that is not always true. And sometimes the employer will take advantage of the fact that you don't really know what the laws are around, safety and workers' rights. And so as a result, they will try and take advantage of them. And Ontario has a fairly strong workplace standards law called the Employment Standards Act. And it has rules about things like how long your shift can be, the minimum amount they are allowed to pay you per hour, how many breaks you get, and overtime and vacation pay rules. And a lot of times students are concerned because maybe there was that 1 week they worked 21 hours instead of 20. And they feel like if they complain about their employer, that their employer will, they'll report them to immigration for violating their work permit. Or, if they're trying to get their permanent residency, that if they complain about their employer might fire them and then they wouldn't be able to get their PR. In reality, the Ministry of Labor is a provincial part of our government. So we have the federal government, and then we have the provincial government, and then we have local government. And so the province is not responsible for anything related to immigration law, and they frankly will not care about whether or not you've worked 21 hours instead of 21 week. And they're going to be much more concerned with the employer taking advantage of you than anything else. And they have a hotline, which is 1-800-531-5551. And again, the link will be down below. And a fairly decent website as well. And they go through all the rules around that. So if you feel like your employer may be taking advantage of you, go and get some good advice, because they probably are. And you can call the Ministry of Labor hotline, and they will send out an investigator, and they will, deal with it quite efficiently. So it is a great resource. The next thing that international students should know about Canadian law is what they can do if they think that a business has cheated them. And in Ontario, we have numerous laws that deal with the protection of consumers. So we have something called the Consumer Protection Act. So that's one. We have the Wireless Services Agreements Act. We have the Discriminatory Business Practices Act. And, just among the rules that are contained within these laws, there's a rule against using a false or deceptive misrepresentation. And so, if they're lying to you to try and convince you to buy their product, or they, deceive you into believing it does something that it does not do, or it will give you some benefit that you don't have, or they try and take advantage of your lack of ability to communicate in English, there are actually very, very strong penalties for that kind of behavior. And as a result, it's actually not that difficult to bring a case based on that. And just to give you an example, one of my first cases I resolved as a lawyer was a Mennonite couple. Mennonites are they're a people who are a sort of separate Christian sect within Canada. They originally came from Russia by way of Mexico to Canada, and most of them speak a language called Low German, which is a version of German. And they are, communities. They're they kind of stick to themselves. They're not very well integrated, and so they can often be victimized by people who are immoral in their actions. And so this poor couple that I dealt with, they had somebody come to their door, knock on their door and say, "I'm from the town, I'm here to test your water because we think it's unsafe." And then they did this test where they put drops in the water. And what the drops did was they made all of the minerals in the water, like zinc and iron, drop to the bottom. And it made this sludge at the bottom. And they say, "Oh, look at that. That's very dangerous. You shouldn't be drinking that," right? But the reality is that stuff at the bottom of the water was perfectly healthy. And in fact, it was better than water without it, because, iron is something your body needs. And so these people, on the basis of this test that had been performed for them, that had deceived them into believing that, this person was from the town, which they weren't, and that their water was dangerous to drink, they agreed to put in a water system. And the water system's actual value was probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,000, $1,200 maybe, for a really good system. But the one that they put in was a much cheaper system. And they charged them $7,800 for it. And so when they came to me, they did not know what to do. They were getting calls from the lender who had financed this water system on behalf of this company. So this company had made them sign documents that said, you'll pay back this bank. And so the bank was like, "Where's our money?" Right? And so I sued the company that had gone door to door, and I sued them not only for the return of the $7,800, like the cancellation of the debt, but also for something called punitive and aggravated damages. And that's like asking the court to not only just make my clients back to where they were when they started, but to actually actively punish the company for what they had done. And because I had that available to me, and there was a reasonably good chance I was going to get something for punitive damages, the other side decided that they would refuse. They did something called rescinding the contract, which basically means they made the contract go away, so my clients didn't owe any money anymore. And from their perspective, they were very, very happy about that. This company had taken advantage of their lack of ability to protect themselves in English. They had done everything that they could do wrong. And so I felt really good. It's one of my favorite cases to talk about because I feel so satisfied from having gotten them justice. You should also know that in these same consumer protection laws, there are also special rules for certain types of agreements or businesses, like wireless agreements. So like your cell phone bills, there are rules around that. I remember when I first started as a lawyer, about 50% of every case in the small claims court involved a cell bill. Okay. Now it's much more reduced, in part because this provisions of the Wireless Services Agreements Act have kicked in, and so they've changed the playing field so that the consumers have more rights. But at the time it was just that was everything in the small claims court all the time, and then there are rules about fitness clubs. So the fitness clubs loves to sign you up for a whole year, even if you because they know you're only going to come for like a month and then you're going to stop coming. And so they love to get that whole year out of you. And then they have an auto renew on it so that it goes for another year without you even knowing. And so, there are rules around what they can and can't do as well. And there are also rules for something called remote agreements. So a remote agreement is one where you don't go to the store to buy something. They come to you. Right? And that's called a remote agreement. And so there are rules around those as well. The next thing that international students should know about Canadian law is some special rules for driving that you might not know. So like most people know a good chunk of the rules of the road. There's a stop sign, stop the car. There's a red light, stop. Green means go. Those kinds of things. But there are other rules that are other people might not know. So the first one is the move over law. So you will oftentimes see an emergency vehicle has pulled somebody over on the side of the road, or there's an accident, or there's a tow truck, or an ambulance on the side of the road. If that happens, and it's possible, you have to move over an entire lane to avoid coming too closely to the emergency vehicle. If there's not an extra lane, you have to move over in your lane as far as you can to avoid coming close to the emergency vehicle. And that's because, you get police officers who are stepping out of their cars. You get ambulance personnel or tow truck drivers who are walking along the side of their vehicle. And they could be easily hit. And in fact, historically, there have been many accidents of this type. And so the move over law is designed to prevent that from happening. The second one is mostly in rural areas, like areas outside of the cities. You will sometimes see what looks like just a normal truck or a car, and there will be people pulling over for this truck or car because it has a green light that's flashing on the dashboard. Okay, in large parts of Ontario, there is not a professional fireman. There's not a fire department that is staffed with full-time firefighters like there is in London, for example, or in Toronto. But they have instead volunteers. And so these are people who have been trained as firefighters, but they have other jobs. And they just, they have one guy who volunteers who's there for the day. And if there's a call, he hops in the truck and goes towards wherever they need to go. And everybody else gets in their personal vehicles from wherever they are, usually at work or somewhere. I've had people in my office who were volunteer firefighters who got called out in the middle of a meeting with me. And I'm like, go, get in your car and go. And they jump in their car and they turn on that green light. And that green light allows them to drive as fast as they like, as long as it's safe to do so. They're not allowed to go through stop signs or red lights, but as long as it's safe and otherwise they're allowed to go, they can exceed the speed limit. And so pulling over allows them to pass quickly, which means that they can get to the scene of the accident or the person who's having a medical problem or the fire as quick as possible. And so if you're in a rural area and you see that green flashing light, pull over to the right and stop and let them pass. The other one that is quite common is not to pass a school bus if the lights are flashing. So you will often see a school bus will stop on the side of the road, and then the lights will start flashing and the arm will come out to say stop. You're not allowed to pass a school bus if the lights go on. And that is because children will be getting out of the school bus and could be walking in front of it, and you might not be able to see them. And if you're passing the school bus, you could hit them. It is a very serious fine, so be very careful. Pedestrians. This is an odd one, because if you come from a country where like people are just everywhere, traffic sort of has a right of way. It's like pedestrians should just get out of the way, or else the traffic will never get anywhere. But here in Canada, the general rule is if the pedestrian is crossing a street, you have to stop and let them go, even if they're walking down the middle of the street. You do not have the right of way; they do, and especially on crosswalks. Inside the city, you will see city buses, and sometimes they have to change lanes and go across several lanes of traffic. If they are indicating, you have to let them in. People don't know that, but they have a right to move over, and you have to stop and let them go if they are indicating that they want to come in front of you. People on bicycles have to obey all of the traffic laws, just like they are a car, which means it actually means signaling too. So there's some arm signals that we use. So this means left turn. This means stop. This means right turn. There are rules against distracted driving. So you can't drive while you're eating, while you're texting, or while you're using your phone. And you certainly can't drink alcohol and drive. The limits are quite low for that. Even 2 beers and driving would probably end up with your car being seized, at least temporarily. So don't drink and drive. It's just a bad idea. And then if you have children, your children have to be an approved and appropriate car seat for their age and weight. So there are different kinds of car seats depending on how old your child is and how much they weigh. And so you need to make sure that you're familiar with those rules. If your child is not in an appropriate seat, there's a significant fine. This leads to the next question, which is, what happens if I get stopped by police and they're asking me questions? What are my rights in that circumstance? And the answer to that is it really depends on the circumstances. So we'll break it down into two sort of sections. So the first section is, are you driving a car? Because if you're driving a car, there's going to be different rules than if you're not driving a car. So if you're driving a car, police can ask for a driver's license, proof of insurance, and ownership at any time for any reason. They can also request information about passengers, but typically they don't unless they are concerned for some reason. And now they can actually ask for a breath sample at any time for any reason to make sure that you're not driving while your ability is impaired by alcohol. Basically, they want to make sure you're not drunk and too drunk to drive, right? It used to be that they needed something called indicia of impairment, which means they needed to have a reason to believe that you might actually have drunk too much in order to drive safely. But that is not the case anymore. That has been changed. Now, if you're not in a car, different rules apply. So you have a general right to be silent. You do not have to answer any questions, and you have a right to get legal advice before you answer any questions. And, any lawyer worth their salt will tell you, don't answer any questions because anything you say can be used against you. And while police are generally friendly and helpful, and they're not to be afraid of, but if you think the police are investigating you for a crime, don't say anything, okay? Don't answer any questions. Ask for a lawyer and refuse to talk, okay? The reason is it's very easy to talk yourself into being charged with something, but it's very, very hard to talk yourself out if they think that if they think they have something to charge you for. So the general rule is, don't talk to them if you think that they're investigating you for a specific crime. Okay. Now, if you're a witness to a crime and, you haven't done anything wrong, then, it's fine to give a witness statement. But if you have any reason to believe that they might think that you've done something wrong, don't answer any questions. The next thing that international students should know about Canadian law is what is acceptable romantic or sexual behavior. So Canadian law has a prohibition on something called sexual assault. And sexual assault means any assault of a sexual nature. Well, that makes you ask the question, okay, well, what is a sexual nature? Which basically has come down to, it means that what is being done for some aspect of sexual pleasure. And then the next question is, well, what's an assault? And an assault is any physical interference. So sexual assault would include unwanted sexualized touching, inappropriate touching on a person's, bottom or on their pubic area or a woman's breasts, unwanted kissing, and any other sexual contact that is without consent, other like all the way up to what we would call forcible rape. And so then that leads to the question, okay, well, if I need consent, what on earth is consent? And basically, at its most basic, it means that both people who are involved in whatever is occurring are agreeing to participate, okay? And, from some cultures, people might imply consent from, the clothes that somebody's wearing or where they are, what time of day it is, whether there's a male person with them, whether they're drunk or not. But none of that can be implied as consent in Canada, okay? Nothing other than a person's direct verbal consent. And special care should be taken where a person is drunk, because their ability to consent may be impaired, right? And so if later they think that what happened was not something that they wanted, then that could end up being a sexual assault, even though at the time they said they would like it, or even if both of you were drunk. And the penalties for sexual assault are very, very serious. I mean, you could go to jail for a significant period of time, and you could also be expelled from your school. So this is something you don't want to take lightly. You want to make sure that you are taking every step to ensure that whatever is occurring is consensual. And the next thing that international students should know about Canadian law is there anything you can't say in Canada? And interestingly to me, when we did the poll, this was the most popular question. And to me, it was interesting that was the case. So the general rule is, no, in Canada you can say anything you want, with a few exceptions. So there's what's called a dangerous words exception. So what is dangerous words? Well, like, you can't cry out fire in a theater that's crowded with people unless there actually is a fire, right? Because what will happen is people will all run for the exits, and some people might get knocked over and then run over by all the other people and die. And so that creates a dangerous situation. And so dangerous words can become something you cannot say. But this exception is very, very narrow. It really has to be a specific call to action that creates a significant risk that people will do something that will endanger other people, okay? So it's a fairly narrow exception. Then there are some rules about inciting hatred against identifiable groups. And this is a very limited exception. Because, again, there has to be an actual potential for violence or criminal acts to flow from the words that you're saying. So you can't, even just, as abhorrent as it is, people are free to say really bigoted things. But to be criminally prosecuted, they have to actually say something that's designed, again, to create a call to action to imminent violence or imminent criminal acts. So, to give a sort of an example, if somebody was saying, not just that they think that this particular group that they don't like shouldn't be around, or should all die, that itself is not criminal. Where it becomes criminal is if you say those specific people of that group who are right over there, they should be, assaulted, right? Or their house should be burned down or something like that. If you say that, and there are people who are likely to actually take those words to heart and then actually do the things that you're saying, that can create a criminal liability. Now, saying that, that is all just about the criminal aspect of things. And there is another aspect, which is civil liability. And with civil liability means, non-criminal punishment. You're not going to go to jail for it. But there are non-criminal punishments for hate speech. So, some of the examples I used about, like, saying that you hate a particular group or hate a particular person because they belong to a particular group, might be punishable under the Canadian Human Rights Act or the Ontario Human Rights Act. And then the other one that is big is defamation. And defamation is a fancy word, but what it really means is saying something to somebody else that is untrue about somebody who's not a party to that conversation, that causes a loss of respect for that person. So communicating it directly to that person and only that person is not defamation. But if you communicate it to anybody else outside of it, then that is considered to be defamatory. And really the only requirement is that it be something that would bring the person down in their respect that other people might have within a particular community. And so you see this a lot in situations where there are people who are engaged in public debate where people will say terrible, mean, and nasty things about them. However, we do have some fairly robust defenses that are available to defamation claims. So, if you're in good faith making a statement that you believe is factual about a matter that's in the public interest, for example, that would be exempt from being sued for defamation. So if you say, I think that politician is corrupt because of this or that, then you might be covered under those exemptions. And there are some very fast ways to get those kinds of claims resolved. But other than that, no, you can say anything you like in Canada. We have fairly robust free speech, at least now we do. Whether or not it'll stay that way is another question. But generally speaking, Canadians can say whatever they like. And then the last thing that international students should know about Canadian law is about our cannabis and marijuana laws. So many people who are international students, they come from other countries where marijuana is illegal. They come to Canada where it is more legal, and they think that there are no rules whatsoever about it. But no, there are still some rules about marijuana. And basically, the law as it stands right now is that possession of cannabis or marijuana is legal for personal use within strict limits. And so you can't possess more than 30 grams. If you possess more than 30 grams, then potentially you could be considered to be in the business of producing marijuana, and then that's illegal. And you can have a maximum of 4 plants per household. And now that is per dwelling unit. So if you have 5 housemates that you share your house with, you can't have 20 plants. You can only have 4 plants total, right? And it's legal to buy from government stores or from other licensed stores now in Ontario. It used to only be the government stores, but now other licensed stores. But buying from other people, like, some friend that is still technically illegal. However, you can share apparently. So, if you have some and your friend wants some, you can give some, but you just can't sell it to them. So be careful. Possession of more than 30 grams is a serious crime, as well as is selling. And then my other caveat is, as with lots of things I've talked about here, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. So even though cannabis may be legal, that doesn't mean it's good for you. And there are a great many studies that show that recreational marijuana use can have serious side effects, particularly for people who are whose brains are still in development, and your brain continues to develop until about the age of 30. So these include mental health issues and a significant number of other issues pertaining to that. So, just because you can smoke marijuana doesn't mean you should. That's all I'm saying. And other drugs besides cannabis are still illegal, and there are serious consequences for even simple possession. So be aware of those. So those are the things I think Canadian international students should know about Canadian law. And I'm interested in anything else that you would like to see covered in this video in a future version of it. And I'm perfectly willing to respond to comments that I think are require a response. Keep in mind, I can't give legal advice because there is a requirement that I identify every client that's my client, and I get a retainer from them. So I can't give legal advice, but I can point you to where you can obtain it. And, feel free to share this video with your friends or anybody else you think might benefit from it. And otherwise, have a great day and take good care of yourself.